Hello and welcome to this special edition of the National Security Conversations. Russia has started, quote unquote, a special military operation against Ukraine. Earlier today, global news outlets cut away from the live coverage of a United Nations Security Council meeting on Ukraine to a surprise early morning television announcement by Russian President Vladimir Putin. Announcing a special military operation in Ukraine, he warned the world that any attempts to interfere would produce, I quote, consequences they have never seen, close the quotes. 3 days ago, when Russia recognized two breakaway regions of eastern Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk, as independent people's republics and signed the friendship treaties with them, the question on everybody's mind was, is there still a diplomatic way out? I think we have the answer to that now. Now that Russian troops have started a so-called special military operation in Ukraine, the question to ask is whether the US-led liberal order and its institutions like the United Nations will survive the ashes of Ukraine. The ability of the United States and its Western allies to deter Russia is for the world to see. China would have drawn its lessons from the crisis, and it is perhaps waiting for an opportunity to implement its own territorial designs elsewhere. Although the United States has imposed a set of economic sanctions in response to the Russian attack, and the European Union has also announced its own sanctions targeting Russian banks and oligarchs, the futility of financial instruments against military might is pretty clear. Will economic sanctions be able to deter Vladimir Putin? Or, as Mr. Putin puts it, the West was going to place sanctions anyway, and the Russians can withstand its repercussions. The larger question before the world today is, how will the current crisis transform European security architecture? And what will it do to the foundations of the US-led international order and its institutions? How will the lessons from Ukraine influence China's Taiwan strategies? And what are the implications for India? To answer these questions, I have with me Ambassador Pankaj Saran. Ambassador Pankaj Saran was India's Deputy National Security Advisor and also was India's ambassador to the Russian Federation. Welcome to the National Security Conversation, Ambassador Saran.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Ambassador Saran, how do you view the fact that even as the United Nations Security Council, of which Russia is the president now, was deliberating the issue of Ukraine, Russian President Vladimir Putin goes on television, announces a special military operations in Ukraine and warns of never before seen consequences if any country interferes in its action against Ukraine? How do you see that?
Well, clearly, this is a somber movement in global affairs, and it is absolutely essential for us to make a very careful assessment of what has happened, why it has happened, and what it could lead to. Clearly, there is the diplomatic effort that we have been seeing for the past many weeks, not to speak of the efforts which began in 2014 and what we are seeing as we speak. So, a clear decision has been taken by the Russian government that they will follow a certain trajectory and a certain path to protect and defend what they perceive are their core national security interests, which, in their opinion, have the character of a red line. And as President Putin mentioned, that red line has been crossed. So, this sequence of events that we have witnessed, starting with the initial exchange of proposals between the US and NATO and Russia on arms control issues, on question of Ukraine's membership of NATO, on the Russian demand for a legally secure and enforceable guarantee about Ukraine not joining NATO, and then the to and fro, which involved the visits by the president of France and the chancellor of Germany to Moscow, and their detailed discussions, as well as, of course, the telephone conversations between the US and Russian leaders. I think the Russians seem to have drawn some conclusions based on these various diplomatic efforts. And it is quite clear that if you look at the two speeches of the last 3 or 4 days made by President Putin, you see there is a thesis, and he is harking back into time. And he comes across, and Russia comes across as someone who has been aggrieved and who has been threatened. And therefore,
Mm.
the actions that he has taken uh, appear to be in response to what they have internalized is a serious security challenge posed by them. And also, there is that element of being pushed to the wall. He talks about 2014. He says that those very, very complicated, extremely difficult discussions, which resulted in the package of measures in Minsk, those have no longer those are no longer valid, and so this gesture of recognizing these two republics, which, by the way, to be clear, were also signatories to the Minsk Agreement. The Lugansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic were signatories and were participants in both the Minsk agreements. So today he has taken the next step. Basically, he is saying, look, what happened in 2014, the Maidan, the change in government. Now, different people do use different words. One side calls it a coup, the other calls it a revolution, etc. So he's basically saying, look, we've gone through all that, and yet this is not going away for Russia. So I have, according to him, done whatever I felt I could to talk this through with NATO and with the Americans, but I'm not getting anywhere. And in the meanwhile, the authorities in Ukraine seem to be inviting external intervention and external presence in Ukraine, including military weapons last year, which is a new element in the entire equation. And so it's a kind of the whole reaction, the Russian reaction, and the two speeches, which I think will go down in history as being very seminal, explain the thought process. But we can discuss it as we go along.
Right. I get your point about these two republics, as it were, Donetsk and Luhansk. Now, I think apparently the military action has gone beyond that. It has gone into the mainland Ukrainian territory. So the scope of the military action at this point of time is not limited to these two republics, as it were. It's gone beyond that. Would you agree with that?
No. This source of your information, I am not sure if it is verifiable. It could be based on media reporting, including by
Right.
Ukrainian
Right.
agencies. But you know, and
Right.
I know, if there is a problem we have with one of our neighbors, and I don't have to name them,
Hmm. Hmm.
there is the outside world does not believe either side. So I think sitting aside and
Hmm.
on the sidelines, it is incumbent on us as a mature nation to be very, very careful about what we read, what is fed to us by the mass media in the affected parties, and take an independent judgment.
So it is your understanding and your reasoning that the Russian action so far is limited to these two republics and not to the mainland Ukrainian territory.
That is what President Putin was emphatic in saying.
Hmm.
This is also what their ambassador in the Security Council said in response to the Ukrainian speech. This is also, by the way, what NATO has said, that we will, in their statement today, we will respond in a manner that is proportionate and non escalatory. And so the use of the word non escalatory is interesting because it is clear that we are on an escalatory ladder. Now, Russia has said, I am going in for a limited operation within the territory of these two republics because there is a history of 10 years of internecine conflict within these republics between the Russian, so called Russian origin, Russian ethnic citizens and the Ukrainians. And, if I can just put it to you, I mean, the Ukraine as it exists today is a highly divided society. The western part of the country and the southeastern part, which is the Donbass region, they have very different ethnic and religious and cultural and also strategic visions of their own country. So I'm just saying this is what the Russian side
Right,
has said. I do not
right.
know. It's difficult to basically to verify any other claims.
Understood. I think you are quite clear, and you put that across abundantly clearly that the Russian action is limited. Now, here is my question. He has done what he has done. What do you think Putin's end game is vis-a-vis Ukraine or vis-a-vis these two republics?
Yeah, that's a good question, because if you look at the behavior of the last few weeks, as I tried to recount to you, he's gone step by step.
Hmm.
Now, we can only infer from the published version of his address to the people of Russia, where he has said, I do not desire anything more than protecting Russia. I want to ensure that these two republics, which have been the root of the problem within Ukraine and between Ukraine and Russia, which all boil down to the whole question of identity, I want to resolve this matter. Now, where he goes from here is a lot of it is going to also depend on how the NATO responds. Now, it's very interesting that, for example, let us say we construct a hypothetical gaming exercise where tomorrow the NATO decides to admit Ukraine into NATO. Let us say, for as an assumption.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
Now that will lead to war because they have already invoked two articles of the NATO treaty, Article 4 and Article 5, which means an attack on me is an attack on everyone. But so far, Ukraine is not a member of NATO. But assuming, say, for a sec, hypothetically, tomorrow they were to admit, which I don't think they will, that would be a sheer case of rapid escalation. On the other hand, the NATO statement is actually still not talking about military action. They are restricting themselves to debilitating sanctions, economic and financial and other sanctions.
Hmm.
They have
Hmm.
not yet used the term of a military action. In fact, the Americans have made an official statement that they will not send their military or their soldiers to Ukraine. What some of the Europeans have said, European countries, is they will send military weaponry to Ukraine, lethal weapons, etc. So, this is one side of the situation. But if the calculation goes awry, uh, then we could be in greater difficulty if the conflict spills beyond these two republics and goes
Hmm.
into the rest of the country. But please keep in mind that the geographical area of Ukraine is almost as large as that of Afghanistan. So, for example, that there is not one Afghanistan. That country is hopelessly divided within itself. And we know that different neighbors of Afghanistan, for example, have disproportionate influence on different parts of Afghanistan. So, the Donbass region, which is of primary concern to Russia, is only one part of it. The population is also not very large. I think, you know, if you look at, say, for example, what he did in 2015, uh, the Russians decided to bombard Syria. And they went in, and it was a highly difficult kind of project because there were multiple stakeholders in Syria. There were the Turkish, the Iranians, the Israelis, the
Mhm.
Americans. It wasn't easy at all, but he still went in. But it was targeted, and he came out of it. He came out of it in a
Mhm.
few years' time. Of course, he succeeded in the mission of restoring Bashar al-Assad as the president of Syria.
Mhm. Mhm.
So in this case, he so that's having been that is one part of the
Right.
story. The other part of
Right.
the story is when he says that look, no one should interfere in this, and if you interfere in this, the consequences will be such that you have never seen in the history of your lives. Now that is a big threat. Now normally no one, particularly no one from a country like Russia, or a leader of a country like Russia would say that. I mean, this is not some tin
That's right.
pot small country.
That's
So
right.
I think that the depth of the feeling is very apparent, and if the other side, does not be careful in a response,
Mhm.
then the consequences are going to be quite bad.
Right.
But we just have to hope that sanity and common sense prevail.
Right, Ambassador Saran. In fact, if you read Putin's statement, he has used all the right words. He's clearly mentioned that he has no territorial ambitions in the rest of the Ukrainian territory. He said it's about self-defense, it's about the legitimate interests of the Russian Federation, etc., etc. Here this is something that we keep hearing about Russia's legitimate concerns in Ukraine. In your personal opinion, do you think Russia is justified in undertaking this military operation?
You know, uh, any action taken by any state, after all, when Pulwama happened, did you or did you not go to Balakot? Why did you go? When the Nepalese were making their constitution and they had kept the entire Madhesis out of it, did you or did you not make a diplomatic effort to convince them that why did you do it? When the Chinese sent in more than 100,000 troops in 2020, did you sleep or did you mobilize? And did you confront them in Galwan? Why did you do it? Every country, and particularly a country which is surrounded by a periphery, which is the playground for third parties, with the express purpose of squeezing you and of attacking your core national interests, has to take some actions to defend itself. This belief that if you are small, then you are helpless is true only to an extent. But the fact is, this is a cruel world, and everyone is using everyone else.
So
And
you
we,
do think Russia has legitimate reasons for carrying out this military operation?
I think Russia has legitimate security interests, just as perhaps Ukraine has, but it has legitimate security interests, and they say that they have gone through a series of diplomatic efforts, but they have been pushed to the wall, and now this is the only. In fact, what he said in his speeches was very simple. He said, "Look, in 1989 or 1990 or 1991, when the Soviet Empire broke up, Ukraine became independent, as did 15 other countries. We had no, as a successor state, we had no problem. I mean, when the British left, they wanted Pakistan, they got it. But if you are going to be determined that even after that, your primary national strategic objective is going to be to continue to provoke and to rupture the core security interests of a bigger state that is next to you, and you are a creation out of that state, then at some stage, every country may have no other choice. And he said in his speeches, I concede that the Soviets were defeated. I concede we created 15 countries. I am not asking for that territory back. But, sometimes people are left with no option. Now, I'm not saying I would therefore defend, but I would also like to then say in the same breath that tomorrow, if we were faced with a similar situation, after all, remember, there are only few countries, few large countries, which have peripheries, which have multiple countries in them. Russia has 14 neighbors, China has 14 neighbors, we have 7, 8 neighbors. All of them are smaller than us, all of them. You know, and I know that
except China.
China also has 14 small neighbors, but everyone, but these smaller countries become vulnerable. Like Pakistan is a pawn in a bigger game. Now,
Right. So,
if
I,
yeah,
so here is the issue, Ambassador Saran. What is happening in Ukraine reeks of secessionism, irredentism, sphere of influence, etc., etc. Now, as a country, can a country like India be in support of secessionism and irredentism? Will that not come back to bite us in the back eventually?
let me ask you a different question. Would you or would you not like to secure your own periphery? Tomorrow, if you have a problem in your periphery, are you going to throw principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity and take a hit repeatedly, year after year, decade after decade, so that you bleed and bleed and bleed? And then you live with the lofty principles of. So there are different cultures. Europe has a culture of bloodshed, of war. They taught the world what war is. We, the Asians, have
Mhm.
not. But if you collectively look between the first war and the second war, they must have lost 30, 40 million people. So their approach to this problem is different. Our approach is different, but the principle is the same. I want to live peacefully and I want a peaceful periphery. Every country wants that. And the larger you are, the more multicultural you are, the more important it is to ensure that. Now, you have raised the question of principle. Yes, principles are important, but principles are a means to something else. After all, this who taught us these principles? We were not even in existence 70 years ago. These principles which you're quoting, we have learned from someone else, the so-called guardians of the global order as it exists today. But those principles now are being used by those same people as well as the Russian side to justify their actions. So I would say, to simplify a complex issue, what is in my interest, what works for us, what are the precedent setting qualities, what would I like to do in a situation like this, rather than stand in judgment, because I am not the guardian of international principles. I'm a participant. But as you know, and I know, we have been saying and shouting from the rooftops that this global order is fundamentally flawed. It was created by five people, the five victors. If you take China aside, four victors. Today, they are the ones who are fighting among themselves. Now, if that structure is imploding from within, and the kind of animistic statements you are hearing among these four, it troubles you a lot, and it asks you the question, forces you to ask the question that if the core of the global world order is itself seems to be crumbling, or they themselves have no referees and umpires and adjudicators, then where do I go? So
Ambassador Saran, I think you have absolutely made yourself very, very clear that national interests, are far more important than any principle. So if you can safeguard your interests, go ahead and do that. Don't worry too much about principles. That's essentially what you're saying, and I get what you're saying. I think there's a certain amount of excellent reasoning behind that statement. Now, having said that, I mean, looking at India's position on what is happening in Ukraine. Do you think India has taken a well considered position about what is happening in Ukraine and what Russia is doing in these two republics? Or do you think India is neutral, or do you think India is partial towards what Russia is doing?
yeah, that's a very good question. See, neither you nor I were born in 1947 or in 1950s. We do not know the thought processes of the Indian decision makers at the height of the Cold War. We we were born and we landed in a mess between two camps, where it was told to us that you are either against us or you're with us. Thank God that today, 75 years later, with our own diplomatic experience and real life experience, we are more mature. In my opinion, the stand that we have taken is a stand that is perfectly valid for the events that have taken place so far. This is a dynamic position. Tomorrow, day after, what may happen? Naturally, our positions will evolve. But insofar as what we have seen till today, I think the stand India has taken is a valid stand. Number one. Number two, I do not think it is a fence sitting stand, because by deciding to take a stand like this, you have made a very conscious choice. And you have said that I will say only this much, and these
Mhm,
are the words I'm going to use, these are the
mhm,
terminologies I'm going to use, they are value neutral, I'm not standing in judgment, and this is what I'm saying. There are people, the two sides to the conflict, and in their minds, those truths are absolute. But I'm not a party to the conflict. When India and China go to a situation as we did in 2020, it would be instructive to see the kind of statements other major world powers issued. So this is the nature of our the world that we live in. So I think it is not a fence sitting case at all. It is a conscious decision, and I think uh, in given the kind of events that have taken place, it looks to be a valid position.
Master Saran, you are joining me on this show from a European city. So, being in Europe at this point of time, how do you assess the reactions in various European capitals? What is Europe, NATO, and the United States, in your opinion, preparing to do?
Again, an excellent question, because I think this, sophisticated analysis somehow escapes the Indian headlines. But the fact is that Europe is extremely badly divided. There are different Europes out here, and their approaches and their perspectives are all a function of their historical experiences. The Baltics have a perspective. The British have one. The French have one. The Germans have one. The Polish have one, and it is in their day-to-day lives. Sometimes they are pulling in different directions. Now, for example, if you look at, say, since 2014, who are the two primary interlocutors with Russia? It's France and Germany. Both the current and previous leaders have maintained excellent channels of communication with the president of Russia and the leadership of Russia. But the Baltics have barely on speaking terms. But it has taken
Hmm.
France and Germany a lot of heavy lifting to bring to shift Europe slightly center stage from much more radical approaches towards Russia. So that's the first point I would like to make. Then there are differences across the Atlantic. And for example, if you look at even say the Nord Stream 2 project, now
Mhm,
if Europe, quote unquote, had taken a decision to reduce its dependencies on Russia for fuel, then Nord Stream 2 should not even have begun. What is Nord Stream 2? Nord Stream 2 is nothing but a pipeline that bypasses Ukraine and
mhm,
connects Russia to Germany. It costs $11 billion. It is under the sea, and it led to serious problems between Germany and Ukraine. The Ukrainians accused Germany of uh, kind of bypassing the Ukrainians and actually shooting the Ukrainians at the back. Because if the traditional pipelines went through Ukraine, Germany was complicit in helping Russia. So there are these, and we know, for
mhm, mhm,
example, that in 2014, when the United States Congress passed the CATSA Act, there was a specific provision which targeted Nord Stream 2, and therefore, German companies were facing US sanctions. So there is a transatlantic division of opinion. And this is a constant seesaw battle. who will be the guardian of European security? What will be the extent of American intervention politically, diplomatically, and otherwise in European affairs? And this is all,
Right.
it's a jigsaw puzzle. I mean, uh, of course, you have Belarus, etc., who are very pro-Russian, but
Right.
broadly
So,
speaking, I'd say this.
right. Please complete your sentence.
No, so I think the behavior of NATO and the behavior of the European Union are slightly different. I would also say it's very
Hmm.
interesting so far that almost all the statements, unless I am missing something, which are coming from either the NATO or the European Union, are limiting their reactions to sanctions. There is little talk about a military response, which is
Hmm.
also to be
Hmm.
interesting.
Hmm. Hmm.
Now,
Hmm.
in 2014, when the sanctions were first imposed on Russia, the Russian government were convinced that what happened in Ukraine and the sanctions subsequent after the events in Crimea were basically meant to engineer a regime change in Moscow. They were convinced, rightly or wrongly. Now, so that itself, if you look at the language of CATSA, you look at the scope and the scale of sanctions, to do it against a power like Russia was unthinkable earlier, unthinkable. But they did it. And Russia lived with it for now 8 years. They're imposing a second set of sanctions, which may be even more debilitating. The question which I'm sure people, decision makers in the Kremlin, are asking is, what can be worse? Now, the other very interesting thing, if we have to try to psychoanalyze the Russian actions, if you look at his first speech of 21st February, which is 3 days
Hmm.
ago, it's a very lengthy speech. You can see he's positioning himself in the annals of Russian history, dating back to the early 20th
Hmm.
century, to the revolution itself, to the Bolsheviks, to Lenin, to Stalin, to Khrushchev. And he himself has now been in power for 22 years. He is he seems to be carrying the weight of Russia on his shoulders.
Hmm.
And so there is a great sense of historicity about the way he has put forth his case. And I really feel it is important uh, for Europe and Russia to try and come to terms with each other's different religious identity, different cultural identity, different political systems. You know,
Right.
I don't see a mediator in this. Who's going to do this?
Right, Ambassador Saran, I think you sort of quite clearly highlighted the fact that the Ukraine crisis has revealed a deep sort of crisis within the Western alliances themselves. What about the global status of the United States of America? First, there was the ignominious withdrawal from Afghanistan in August last year. Thereafter, we saw the return of the Taliban to Afghanistan, and now Ukraine. Is the United States global leadership in terminal decline? And this is happening um, quite worryingly so when India is getting closer to the United States, especially as part of Quad and the larger Indo-Pacific construct. So, how do you think this has this has led to this will lead to a terminal decline of the United States global status, and what implication would that have for India? Given the fact that we are pretty close to the United States today.
Well, good. Again, a good question. When you look at the terminal decline and the role of the United States, I think it is going to be determined not by how they handle Russia, but by how they handle China. And that is going to
Mhm.
be
Mhm.
the future challenge for US leadership of the world. And as India, it's my personal opinion, we would be better off with a world order which is governed by the principles of democracy, shared values with the United States, and a more equitable liberal order. So, this particular incident, I do not think could be kind of, let us say, equated with some kind of a judgment call on uh, what happens to the United States leadership of the world. I think this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity. If the US wants to do some deep introspection about how they wish to galvanize partners, allies, and take forward the world order which exists as we know it. We must remember the same questions were actually asked in 1991. Now, again, in 1991, we were passive recipients of the collapse of the Soviet Union. We were neither a party to it, nor were we consulted by anyone, nor did we contribute to it. But we were sitting on we were bystanders and we saw what happened. And that led to the emergence of a unipolar world. The Russians and President Putin himself admits that yes, the Soviet Union was defeated. The Cold War resulted in the victory of only one power. So uh, now, between 1991 and 2022, if you were to put a finger on one major systemic change in the world, that is the rise of China. Now, that is a story by itself. While you had a unipolar world, and while you had this transatlantic alliance, and while you had actually defeated the Soviet Union and communism, yet you had, and then if you remember in 1991, the first question which people asked was, is China going to suffer 1991? Is China also going to go the Soviet way? I mean, is there going to be a Chinese Gorbachev? But that did not happen. What we did see was exactly the opposite. And we saw the strengthening of Chinese national power at an extraordinarily rapid pace. Now, as India, I would like to use every such opportunity, global opportunity, regional opportunity, to harness my bearings and move forward and try to see how much I can move forward. We did a lot of it after the pandemic. It was a wake up call for us. We realized our weaknesses and we took several decisions to ramp up our capabilities on the economic and other side.
Right,
So,
Ambassador Saran, here is the problem. You sort of very you made a very sharp comment and very interesting one, very insightful one. You said the U.S. global status will be determined by how it handles China and not how it handles Russia. But from a balance of power point of view, Russia and China together are perhaps emerging as a counterpole to the United States and and the West. So the question is, how do we as a country, how does India situate in the middle of this? China is a challenge and a threat to India. There's no question about that. And China and Russia are close to each other. And we are close to the United States also because we want to sort of face up to the Chinese challenge, but we want Russia in the continental sphere precisely because the Americans have left Afghanistan, and we need to reach out to Afghanistan and to Central Asia and collaborate with the Russians in the sort of continental periphery. So the question is, geopolitically speaking, how do we sort of situate in the middle of this balance of power competition that is emerging at this point of time?
yes, again, very good. Many years ago, when we saw the national security strategy of the United States, I think it was under President Trump and perhaps before that,
Mhm.
they identified both Russia and China as systemic rivals. So, as it is, when they did their internal introspection, they had arrived at the conclusion that both these countries are going to be their either systemic rivals or adversaries or whatever. Now, a natural consequence of making public such an assertion is that you somehow propel the two to come together and get closer to each other. And this is not some thing which is unforeseen. It is, in a sense, fairly inevitable in the kind of a global construct. And obviously, the Americans are confident of their national power and the strength of their alliance to handle Russia China relationship. So that is one part of it. So in other words, I'm saying the Americans have gone into this kind of a construct with open eyes. It's not as if this has happened by accident. And if they have gone with open eyes, they also have plans to implement this national security strategy. And I think what we are seeing today is perhaps a play out of the fact that, we will handle both challenges. We are capable together alone and with our allies. Now, insofar as we are concerned, it's a challenge for us because, uh, if you're a country of 1.3 billion people, firstly, you can never be alone. It's difficult to have 1.3 billion people feeling alone. The question is, you have to have a fairly good awareness of who you are, what you are, you know, and you have to take decisions, right or wrong, but with some conviction about what suits your interests. And our interests are in maintaining good relations with the US, with the European Union, with the transatlantic alliance, as well as with Russia. You know, if you walk through or think through the consequences of alienating Russia, those could actually land you in a self fulfilling prophecy. And this is what a lot of your own enemies are hoping will happen,
Absolutely.
whether it is China, whether it is Pakistan. They're playing these games with you. If you fall for the trap, which is easy because it sounds so convenient and simple, then I think policy planners in India will be doing a great disservice to the country.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Ambassador Saran, the reality is that India would have liked a rapprochement between the United States and the Russian Federation simply because if there is no, if there isn't too much animosity between these two great powers, as it were, then the global focus could be on China, and it is and the challenge that China poses to India and the rest of the world, as it were, in many ways. But that is not what is happening. The reality is that there is now a growing confrontation between Russia and the West and the United States. And we need both these countries, as you correctly pointed out. We need the Russians in the continental sphere. We need the Americans in the maritime sphere because of the threat that we face from the Chinese. Obviously, if what our policies will be determined by our own strategic autonomy, as it were. But the fact of the matter is that if tomorrow, if we are forced to choose, how are we going to deal with that? I know if we are not going to be forced to choose. We will take a decision based on our national interest. I understand that part of it. But in real politics, there will be choices one will have to make. And how are we going to navigate that difficult territory, as it were?
Yes, that is going to be a challenge for our policy planners. And I would only say that when the Soviets entered Afghanistan in 1979, we were confronted with a choice. When the Americans invaded Iraq and Libya, we were confronted with a choice, etc. So, we will do it. I mean, I don't know whether I can make a rational or a considered reply to your question in this format, but it is conceivable to take decisions, but they are so dynamic, so contextual that anything that we discuss today might not be applicable. But yes, if there is a choice to be made, and if we feel that there is no other way out, we will make the choice. But as of now, the response from India has been proportionate, it has been measured, and I think, frankly, it sounds very ironical to say, But if we can be that sane voice in this kind of madness and help to tone down temperatures, that would be good. But also, I would say, keeping at the back of our mind very, very clearly what is going to be in our interest, what can come to haunt us in the future, how we perceive our own role, our own status, not just in South Asia, but in the Indo Pacific region, etc. So, this is how maybe one can put it at this stage.
One final question before we end the show, Ambassador Saran. There's a lot of talk and speculation in the among commentators and in the media itself about what implications does the Ukraine crisis have for China's approach towards Taiwan going forward. Do you think such comparisons are nonsensical, or do you think such a comparison sort of has some merit?
No, they are natural. I mean, I wouldn't blame anyone for trying to make those comparisons, but but to the extent all comparisons are odious and they are not perfect, with that qualification, I think one difference between the two is that in the case of Russia Ukraine, Ukraine separated from Russia. It became independent. That was a consequence of the breakup of the Soviet Union. In the case of China, Taiwan was a breakaway part of China, but the Chinese ambition is to reunite Taiwan. China has never said, I will give Taiwan the independence that it seeks. But in the case of Ukraine, Russia has said, you have got the independence that you wanted. You got it 30 years ago. But
No,
despite
but
that,
I think that point is quite clear. What is not clear is that does this embolden the Chinese to sort of take coercive military action against the Taiwanese, looking at if the Americans and the NATO forces do not respond militarily, will it embolden the Chinese vis-a-vis Taiwan? I think that's a fundamental question.
it could. I mean, there, I'm sure, would be divisions within the Chinese Communist Party between the hardliners and others. And yes, it is theoretically possible, but I think it would have dire consequences.
Ambassador Saran, thank you so much for joining the show. Fascinating insights. Such a great pleasure listening to you. And thank you, everyone, for watching the program. Have a good evening.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Pleasure being with you. Thank you.